Thank you. I think nothing rounds out a hot day in the Maldives like talking about waste. So thanks for your indulgence. Before we actually dive into the subject of the presentation, I feel like I should give a little bit of context for my involvement, just because it's fairly obvious why Richard would get up and talk to you about air travel, but maybe less so why I would be talking to you about this subject. And when I looked at the list of who was involved in this symposium, and I thought, well, maybe this is a group of people who have had their heads down in the books and in the computers so much that they don't engage much with pop culture, and I can just talk as a waste treatment aficionado. But since there's evidence that some of you have occasionally popped in a DVD and seen me mucking around in a movie now and then, I feel like I want to give you a little context for how this came to be my main occupation. I'd say, you know, look at me as somebody who moonlights occasionally in film work away from what's become my main passion and occupation, which are addressing sustainability and conservation issues from many angles, philanthropic, advocacy-wise, and also entrepreneurially. I think in terms of advocacy, I've been serving for the last couple years as the United Nations Ambassador for the Biodiversity Program, attached to the Convention on Biodiversity and the UN Environment Program. I've worked for many, many years in an activist, philanthropic sense on some very, very exciting projects in the area of community economic development and conservation. And Basswood is the most entrepreneurial side of my engagement with many of the issues that have been discussed here over the last 2 days. A number of years ago, a group of us who were interested in the entrepreneurial and investment side of grappling with some of the thorniest issues involving greenhouse gas reduction, more sustainable infrastructure and technology, came together around the very brilliant and visionary work of an engineer and biochemist named Paul Baskis. We seed funded his work and out of it built a company to provide a very cutting edge and different technological approach to waste treatment on a municipal, industrial, agricultural scale. And along with sort of the technology that we offer, we've made it a mission as a company to try to address also the underlying game theory and strategy of the way that waste treatment is addressed and approached strategically within numerous contexts: private industry, private sector tourism, municipal, and also agricultural, each of which contains its own thorny problems and obstructions to doing what we know nature does a very good job of, which is turning organic waste into non-toxic inorganics. We just haven't figured out in our history of humanity how to replicate that very efficient and effective process that nature does so well. This is largely, this is not an issue of understanding organic chemistry, because most organic chemists can explain to you very easily, any graduate student can explain to you how a cow craps in a field and it doesn't become toxic cellulosic sludge, but rather healthy soil. But we have had a problem of population, aggregation, volume, and systems management in terms of how do we most effectively replicate that natural process and create positive positive end of cycle results instead of expensive and toxic problems. So with that introduction, I think what I'd like to do is discuss a little bit our view of, give a little bit of an overview on what we all know on a basic level is a problem, which is the incredible global crisis of wastewater management and its ramifications and implications. Talk a little bit about the current state of the technology that we see out there, and then I'm going to let our CEO, Mike Walker, give you a little bit more of a dissection of the differentiation between the baseline technology that the world has been using up to now and then what we see as a happier vision of the future, both technologically and strategically, in terms of dealing with wastewater. Skip through that. You know, more people in the world today have cell phones than they have access to a working toilet. 1 in 8 people on this planet still don't have access to safe drinking water, and this is despite the fact that more than half the diseases in the world we know are caused by unclean water. Worldwide, it's nearly 1.1 billion people lack access to safe water. Only 62% of the world's population has access to improved sanitation technology, which is defined as a sanitation facility that ensures hygienic separation of human waste from human contact. 1.2 billion people have no waste facility available to them at all. Of the 60 million people that get added to the population centers of towns and cities every year, most of them occupy slums and shanty towns that have no sanitation facility. So we're moving incredible volumes of people into concentrated situations with no waste treatment solution. And even though human development is more closely linked to access to water and sanitation than any other sector, including health, education, or access to energy, this sector is in some ways the one facing, being offered, we think, the fewest new innovative solutions. Let's talk about a little bit about the health effects of a lack of good sanitation and wastewater treatment. 88% of cases of diarrhea worldwide attributable to unsafe water, inadequate sanitation, or insufficient hygiene. 1.7 million people every year dying from diarrheal diseases. 90% of all deaths caused by diarrheal diseases are children under 5 years of age, almost all in developing countries. And it's estimated that improving sanitation facilities would reduce diarrhea-related deaths in young children by more than 1/3. Investments in safe drinking water and sanitation is known to contribute to economic growth. The World Health Organization estimates that for every dollar invested in drinking water and sanitation, $3 to $34, depending on regions and technology, is returned to the national economy. An incredible statistic about lost productivity. In the developing world, in just one day, more than 200 million hours of women's time is consumed for collecting water for domestic use. This lost productivity is calculated to be greater than the combined number of working hours worked in a week by employees at Walmart, UPS, McDonald's, IBM, Target, and Kroger. This is according to water.org. More than 80% of sewage in developing countries is discharged untreated into rivers, lakes, and coastal areas. And as you guys know well, tourists use approximately 8 times more water than a day than most residents. So we know that we've got a major global problem, not a tertiary problem, not a problem that radiates off of others, but a problem that is arguably basal to a lot of our other challenges in terms of development, human health. the obstruction that a lack of waste treatment and wastewater infrastructure represents it's an enormous impediment to a lot of what we're trying to achieve, both in terms of environmental conservation and human development and human health. So what's the landscape? What are the different landscapes in which we're facing this problem? Well, looking at the United States, arguably one of the most developed countries in the world, massive water infrastructure overhaul is needed. The EPA, Environmental Protection Agency in the United States, estimates that up to $1 trillion of investment is needed over the next 20 years to upgrade municipal waste treatment capacity. 35% of all treatment plants in the United States, roughly 18,000 sites, are currently violating EPA standards and under some form of litigation or consent order. Cost of EPA compliance is completely unaffordable to most cities and towns in the United States, which are drowning under budgetary shortfalls, and the federal government won't foot this bill. So you have an incredibly intractable problem in a developed country like the United States. So what's the developing world scenario? Well, obviously a similar situation in terms of investment needed to upgrade outmoded legacy facilities, the same as in the developed world. Environmental, economic, logistical challenges of implementing the collection systems that are needed to support any new centralized waste treatment projects. Obviously, in many cases, you just don't have the pipe laid to bring it into any kind of centralized facility. This is compounded by dense city and the growth of urban populations with no existing collection infrastructure. So you end up with a lot of people still in need of the most basic forms of sanitation. There's an estimate that there are 17,000 towns and villages in China alone that have no current sanitation option. On the other hand, in the developing world, there are interesting and ironic opportunities to be taken in. There's a tremendous opportunity in many of the countries that have the lowest baseline technology to embrace new technologies and architectures and vault over some of the outmoded infrastructure that the Western world is and the developed world is unfortunately shackled to. There's increasing economic strength in some of these countries to develop, implement and invest in new infrastructure projects. These countries are going to get to benefit from 75 years of experience in the developed world with waste treatment and its inefficiencies, and hopefully improve on them. And there's definitely an increased demand from the citizenry of in developing world countries and an expectation that basic sanitation is going to get provided, and an increasing demand for that as a priority. Looking at, because we're here at this Six Senses resort, we also thought it's worth looking at sort of what do we see as the baseline in most resort scenarios. As is the case in the Maldives, ocean dumping of untreated waste is the standard worldwide. No regulations banning or restricting discharge of effluent into the oceans, no risk of fines, no economic, direct external economic demand on the tourism industry. Most current package plants that are offered require significant amounts of energy and almost universally produce higher effluent levels on the end of pipe that are not suitable for water reuse. So in places like the Maldives, where a lot of people are doing desalination, they're not even getting secondary reuse out of the water because it's not coming out of the waste stream at a high enough quality of treatment. Leach field technology requires a lot of acreage and doesn't necessarily scale well in large population centers. You have septic tanks that leak and contaminate groundwater and ocean water, especially in situations like the Maldives where you have shallow groundwater. And as I said, water reuse very, very rarely incorporated into the waste treatment platform. So in many ways, we're looking at a grim landscape almost across the board, from private sector scenarios to municipal scenarios. Developing world has a certain set of problems, The developed world has a different set of problems. Everybody is facing what's increasingly amounting to a global crisis that's interconnected with many of the other issues that we define as our most pressing issues, and many of those issues insoluble in some sense until we grapple with this underlying issue of waste treatment.